Can you tell us what happened when you published your book in China?
Oh, for sure. I learned from my publisher, Crown, that a Chinese publisher in Shanghai bought rights to my book, One Simple Idea, and was translating it into Mandarin. And naturally, I was thrilled. And I started working with a really talented, wonderful translator living in Shanghai. And she was doing yeoman's work on the book, and we would have Skype sessions together where sometimes we would talk about different spiritual concepts because folks who grew up in China obviously come into the world with a different vocabulary and set of cultural reference points than we do in the West. And more so, we in the West tend to think we have a pretty good working definition of Buddhism or certain philosophies that emerged from the East. And sometimes our understanding as Westerners of Buddhist philosophy may be very different from the understanding of people who grew up either in or adjacent to Buddhist cultures and places where the philosophy grew historically and geographically. So we had an interesting and fertile exchange, and everything was going like gangbusters until it reached publication time, and they had to submit the manuscript to the government censors, not to Publishers Weekly,
Yeah.
not to the Washington Post Book World, but to the government censors who review almost everything that gets published within mainland China. And the government censors came back and said, well, we want you to cut about 30% of the book. So about 30% of my book, One Simple Idea, was cut, including an introduction that I had published, especially for the Chinese edition, in which I wanted to expose Chinese readers to certain ideas about American metaphysics, talk about how some of our metaphysical ideas here in the West comport or seem to comport with Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and how there are differences between how the Western and Eastern reader may view some of these philosophies and different touchstones and points of view, all of which is quite natural. And I was really looking forward to commencing this East-West dialogue until the Chinese government got involved. And the fact is, Chinese government censors are very suspicious of any kind of non-materialistic thought. Their point of view is that the baseline Marxist philosophy under which they see China as functioning is a materialist philosophy, and frictions in society or the search in life are class-based, are economic-based, maybe have to do with different historical epochs running up against one another. But the idea that the individual has both a physical life and an extra-physical life is very threatening to Chinese government ideology because they don't want to see there being any alternative pull or alternative allegiance drawing the individual towards something that there can be no government or commercial control over. And by definition, the spiritual or the extra physical, however you want to view it, is something that no one can control. It's every individual's birthright. It's the ultimate freedom in a certain sense. And that runs afoul of the instincts of government censors in China. Hence, if you speak English, if you read English, if you live in a place in the world where you can get a copy of One Simple Idea, you can read the whole thing. But in China, you can only read about 70% of it. And the introduction, which I was really looking forward to bringing to Chinese readers, was cut. And I recently posted that introduction on Medium. So if you're interested, you can read it there in English, of course.
So many ironies to go into here. Maybe
Yeah.
the most interesting thing to me, if I double back around, actually there are several things that are really fascinating, is that I'm rereading the introduction again in my head right now, and what I
Yeah.
realize is the introduction was a reminder. It was a reminder of where they came from. And I can understand that being a little destabilizing, but it's saying, this is your history. This is your
Yes.
birthright.
Yes. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, animism, ancestor worship, these are things that have profoundly deep roots in the East, much older than any of our spiritual philosophies here in the West. These outlooks have changed the entire world, and the government in that case is keeping the everyday person from accessing these things, understanding these things. They're almost being written out of history in a certain sense.
It's interesting. So let's talk about history. Let's talk about politics from an apolitical standpoint as much as we
Yeah,
can here. This
of course.
idea, thoughts become things, isn't just scary in the East, it's scary in the West. I was watching recently an attack on Marianne Williamson. It was an
Uh-huh.
article that went absolutely viral that was slaying her for basically having an idea of thoughts become things, of causative thought. Why is this so threatening today? And I'm seeing it as a positive. Do you see it that way?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm glad you brought that up because we always tend to see, we as individuals, as human nature, we see the censorious impulse as always existing somewhere else. You know, when I'm speaking at a New Age center or something and somebody introduces me and references the fact that I've been censored in China, everybody applauds as if we would never do that. I would never do that. We support free speech. We support free expression. We're unafraid. But of course, everywhere in corporations, on college campuses, in spiritual centers, you find the censorious impulse, and it exists. There are people who have to resign their jobs every day in government. They might be whistleblowers, they might have a point of view that is reasonable but at odds with the executive branch. They, from all different walks of life, people have to quit their livelihoods because they are under duress. It might not be institutional censorship, but there are instances in our nation of institutional censorship, whether it has to do with social media, corporations, college campuses, spiritual centers, new age centers. It goes on all the time. So the first thing we have to do is be very wary of the notion that the bad guy is always someone else. The person with the censorious impulse is always someone else. It's human nature. It's worse in some places than others, but it's something we all need to watch for. I've certainly experienced it. The other point that you raised, which is very important, is why are people threatened by Marianne Williamson's ideas, for example? Why is thought causation threatening to people? And I suspect part of the reason is that we too are a very materialist culture, and people are, in some cases, very worked up, very fearful, very worried that if you are too assertive about the idea of the extra physical, whether it be spiritual, whether it be something to do with ESP, whether it be something to do with psychical abilities, whatever it may be, if you are too emphasizing of the extra physical, some critics get very worried that it's going to fly open this door of irrationality, and suddenly, we will enter this lost in space world in which we're all assuming that time is not linear and thoughts are causative and there's some sort of extra physical communication or reactions that occur between us. I believe all of that is true. None of that keeps me from having four walls and a roof over my head. None of that keeps me from earning my daily bread. None of that drives me into any kind of disastrous distraction. You can only measure delusion in terms of personal conduct. Otherwise, it just becomes this subjective assertion that one ice cream flavor is better than another. The logic becomes no deeper than that. Marianne Williamson has proven to be a very effective person on the world stage, on the national stage. The individual may or may not like her politically, may or may not like her spiritually, but she has composure, she's effective, she speaks respectfully, she's enormously capable of enunciating her ideas under very stressful conditions. Where's the delusion? Where's the danger? What has she unmasked that has proven distracting or disastrous?
Well, you just asked the key question. Where is the danger? And my guess is we're looking at if the individual realizes the power that we all have within us, then the powers that be have to shift. They have lost some of their
Yes.
power. They have to share some of their power, to say the least. And that's very unsettling.
It's enormously unsettling. It is easier to control people when they feel that consumerism and a certain very limited retinue of political or spiritual choices is available to them. It's much more difficult to control people when they tend to think in terms of very open ended possibilities. And yet, what could be greater tonic for the individual who's suffering than to realize that he or she is filled with possibilities? Just the other night, I was watching the final episode of the show Mad Men, to which I've become very belatedly addicted. And there was this deeply touching, wonderful scene that was shot at the Esalen Institute out at Southern California, where a man was in an encounter group and he was breaking down in tears. And he was saying that he's been working at his job for such and such number of years. He's been a householder for such and such number of years. And no one sees him. No one knows he's there. And he broke down in tears. And the protagonist of the show, Don Draper, walked over and embraced him. And I thought to myself, I wish I was in the room with that man. And we've all been in the room with that man. Maybe we've been that man at different times. Because the truth is, although what he's describing may be true, may be accurate, may be difficult, there's suffering involved, he hasn't stopped to consider perhaps the retinue of possibilities that are available to him. He may need to keep his job for economic purposes, but there is a code of behavior and possibility in his life that he alone controls, It doesn't seem that way. But that's, I believe, conditioning. And if we start to realize, as I think Williamson is trying to push us towards, that our lives can draw upon a vastly wider retinue of political, spiritual, psychological choices than we realize, we become much more epic. We become larger. We also become more difficult to control.
I see such a beautiful, positive shift coming in the world, Mitch. I just had an amazing time talking with Mitch Horowitz. To see more videos on how thoughts become things, click here, subscribe below.